Okay, that's weird. Anyway, yeah, let's just get. Let's see if the portal's behaving this morning. That's really loud. Wow. Okay. I apologize for that. Uh, excuse me. Alright. So that's been sent out. Give that a couple of minutes. Oh, yes. Quality, why do you gotta be so dumb? Okay. Apologies for all of this. I forgot to turn the heat on last night because I didn't realize it was going to get so cold. And it was very hard to. It was very hard to get up this morning. I woke up and it's like, why is it so cold? And I checked my phone and it's like, oh, it's 46 outside. uh, oh, I tried to full screen my PowerPoint through the YouTube page. That was dumb. Alright. So, I realize that we have less time than I thought. So, we're going to go through the rest of this material, which will be the last stuff before the test. And rather than being like, okay, that's it for the day, and then be done early, I'm going to move on to the next chapter um, and just start tearing into the material for the next chapter like as soon as I can. So, that's how that's going to be. So yeah, Germany sent Vladimir Lenin home, Leon Trotsky as well, and they're, as I said, the main folks doing the whole Bolshevik Revolution thing. Let me see. Let me grab my book. I didn't bother turning on the heat because it's kind of loud. So I've got my long sleeve shirt and my throw blanket. So I'm probably going to get a cat here in a little while because they like laying on these throw blankets. Alright. Alright, Russian Revolution. No. Wrong Russian Revolution. That Russian Revolution. Alright, so there's the Bolsheviks. Again, Lenin down here. Again, I'm not sure which one is Trotsky. We don't. I shouldn't say we don't have pictures of Trotsky. Trotsky isn't as famous as Lenin. Trotsky was often the muscle, like he got stuff done with the army. Lenin was, usually the face of what was going on, as you can see here. So, now this was in February, at least as far as the old Russian calendar. Now, let's see, does it say here? No. All right. So the provisional government was still attempting to fight the war. They had several setbacks on the Eastern Front, which is to say things were extremely bad. Thousands of soldiers being killed or captured, losing miles and miles of land. So before the elections in October, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace and seized important infrastructure to essentially take over. So they had a revolution on top of a revolution. Now, the Bolsheviks, are now the Soviets, as they call themselves, wanted to try to continue the war because the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was not good for the Russians, obviously. But the Germans continued to plow into Russia. So like, okay, we'll go with this treaty because clearly, it's not a good treaty, but trying to continue the fight would be worse. Luckily for the Russians, Germany did eventually end up losing the First World War, and Russia was able to gain back some important areas such as Ukraine, which is or was the main area for Russia as far as food production. So this is the storming of the Winter Palace. This is a more dramatic artistic representation. Now remember, all this is going on while World War I is still happening. Yeah, so this is how much land Germany and Austria-Hungary had gained during the war and with the treaty. Also, the Ottoman Empire had gained a little bit of land down here. And I mean, That's a lot of land. You know, it's more land than France. Now, while the war ended in Russia with Brest-Litovsk, the country did have years of civil war. And again, this is another instance of we could talk about that for an entire semester. I mean, the civil war and famine in Russia over the Bolshevik Revolution was probably worse than the First World War for Russia. It resulted in. Oops. Oh, bloody hell. I don't have time for this. Don't message me. No. Um, it resulted in, hundreds of thousands of casualties, both military and civilian. Let's see. Yeah, 2 million civilian deaths. Bulgarians, Austrians, Ottomans made separate peace treaties, and Germany fought alone the last few months of the war. I forgot to bring my water with me. Shit. There was one final spring offensive, but it finally ground to a halt, was reversed, and Germany's chancellor brokered a peace. However, the generals and the Kaiser never actually admitted defeat in this war, which would cause issues later on. So the armistice was signed November 11th, 1918, um, which officially ended the war, but it took time to put together the terms of the peace. And Woodrow Wilson, oh, by the way, America got involved at some point here. Woodrow Wilson was heavily involved in this to try to keep Europe from setting itself up for another one of these wars. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out. Yeah, so here's that German offensive. They pushed in pretty hard, um, but they only had, because of the troops they were able to pull in off of the Eastern Front, um, but they only had so much steam left, uh, and they were able to push back and finally wear the Germans out until the Chancellor brokered a peace. And I don't know if you can hear that, but I apologize. I need to turn off the... Yeah, just turn off the desktop audio. You guys don't need to hear anything my desktop sound is making because it's loud and annoying. Alright. So, towards the end of the war, there was a massive influenza outbreak. Again, this could be an entire day's worth of lesson, um, if not more, because there's like in-depth videos of it online. I mean, stuff I would suggest you guys look into if you're interested. It was actually our last major pandemic outbreak, which was why, like, what's happening today, but people are like, oh, we've never seen anything like this before. That's bullshit. We've literally seen something like this before 100 years ago. Um, this killed 50 million people worldwide at a time when the world population was around 1.8 billion. This was absolutely devastating for the world itself. Let me see. Yeah. Um, Now it was called the Spanish flu uh, because Spanish newspapers were the first to report on it because Spain was neutral in the conflict. Needless to say, during the middle of a war, if there's this sudden pandemic going around that's killing people, newspapers aren't going to report on it because it's going to make people think, hey, maybe we shouldn't be having this war because people are dying from a disease. Um, but yeah, people were calling off, you know, or people weren't reporting on it. But it's the most recent evidence is that it started in the United States, where it killed over 500,000 people. There were Pacific Islands where it completely wiped out the population there. This is actually the reason why in certain cultures, like in Japan, and France as well, um, when people are sick or there's the concern that one might get sick, they wear face masks. Here in the United States, that's not usual. Like with this coronavirus thing, um, people are, it's like, hey, you should wear a face mask out in public, and a lot of people just aren't doing it because that's not normal here. Um, while if you watch, say, something, from especially from Japan, face masks are just normal. That's just like, oh, I'm going out in public and I feel like I might be getting sick. So, um, I'm not I'm gonna have this mask on just in case. So yeah, that's this Spanish flu like really changed a lot of world culture, and it's stayed that way for the last 100 years, and now this COVID-19 event may do the same thing. I doubt it's going to kill 50 million people, um, but the response so far has been not great. Um, so we'll see what happens. Let's see what else. Oh, and the thing is, the Spanish flu killed really fast. And it wasn't just people who were immunocompromised or the elderly or weak. Um, it mentioned that people would get in a train car. Soldiers, healthy soldiers, would get in a train car, and by the time they got to their destination, it would just be a train car full of dead bodies. I mean, it was just atrocious. Um, let's see. It also just something to mention for what's going on right now. Uh, the Spanish flu receded during the summer and then came back stronger during that following winter, and killed more people than it did the previous winter, despite you know them having dealt with it before. So if this thing ebbs out during the summer, don't think it's gone. Just a PSA. Um, yeah. So moving on. Some lovely pictures here of morgues hospital, makeshift hospitals in, like warehouses. Um, this lovely one, Spanish influenza, the danger of the prosecution of the war in Europe. There were 1,500 cases in the Navy Yard. 30 deaths already resulted. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza. Don't spit. Uh, so, the whole thing where people just like spitting. Don't spit. I had more for another class. Like, they were on the back of trolley cars and stuff. Don't spit. Spit equals death. So, the countries that were victorious in the war, so the Entente, had to decide how to settle the peace. Um, as I mentioned, did I say Woodrow Wilson or did I say somebody else? I think I said Woodrow Wilson. Um, he wanted to set guidelines to increase stability of Europe. Two of the main points were national self-determination, so nation states, and the creation of the League of Nations, which was a proto United Nations. It wasn't as strong as United Nations is. My mouth is getting dry. To handle these international disputes. Now, while he did eventually get most of the European powers to agree to this, when he came back to the United States, Congress would not join the League. So the U.S. president was able to get Europe to agree to these things, but not the United States. Because they're like, oh, this is just entangling alliances. It's like, no, we're trying to all get along. And this idea of self-determination was turned into mandates. Basically, these countries would be put under the temporary control of a larger, more powerful country like Britain, usually, Britain or France, until they were able to govern themselves. So yeah, there's the 14 points. Open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, which I'm sure Britain didn't like. Removal of economic barriers, so free trade, production of armaments, colonial claims, the conquered territories in Russia, which I'm sure Russia was happy with. Belgian sovereignty, I'm sure that was an easy one to get rid of. Restoration of French territory, again, France was like, cool. Italian frontiers, Austria-Hungary, Balkan territories, limitations on Turkey, independent Poland, and then the independent or Association of Nations. So, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory with the Treaty of Trianon. Bulgaria lost Yugoslavia, had to reduce its army with the Treaty of Neily. The Treaty of Saint Germain gave the Austrians such a small amount of land that even the socialists, who were like, not really for any amount of what, cat? Any amount of land, not for the countries or whatever, that they should just join up with Germany. Basically there was so little left of Austria that even the socialists were like, screw it, let's join up with Germany. Now, Germany, with the Treaty of Versailles, uh, lost all sorts of territory to the French and the Poles, had to pay these huge war indemnities, which was an issue. Disarmed the military, we'll see how that goes. And signed the War Guilt Clause, which forced them to agree that Germany caused the war. Also will cause issues. So this is what is left after World War One. So Austria, look how tiny Austria is. Remember, Austria was like all of this before. It was. I mean, it was smaller than Germany. After Germany, became a thing, it was a little bit smaller than Germany, but it was still really big. Germany lost, this land here, uh, all of this land here, because, Eastern Prussia is still Germany, so it got this big cut out so that Poland could have access to the sea. So that's weird. Um, there's Alsace and Lorraine. So yeah. And finally, here at the end of the First World War, there was the issue within the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks wanted to take Istanbul and the Asia Minor coast, uh, but the Turkish army still existed, and fighting under the nationalist hero Mustafa Kemal crushed the Greek armies and drove them and many Greeks and Armenian civilians out of Asia Minor. Now, at this time, Kemal and the Greek statesman Eleftherios Venizelos wanted to try to avoid genocide because, there was a lot of hatred on both sides. So they traded 1.2 million ethnic Greeks who spoke Turkish were sent to Greece, while 800,000 ethnic Turks left Greece to come to Asia Minor. Um, now, I mean, the idea was there, but it was only going to stall, you know, issues that were going to crop up. And that is that chapter. So, um, give me a moment. I'm going to run and grab my water, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to get to the next chapter because, like I said, we don't have a ton of time left in the semester, so I want to try and knock out what we have left while we can. So, I know it. I will be right back because my mouth is going dry. forgetting my water and it being like just down the hall isn't such a big deal compared to forgetting my water and it being, like 30 to 45 minutes away. And even better, I was able to get a refill. Oh, come on, blanket. How'd I end up getting it all flipped around? Okay. Alright. So, let's minimize that. And get that ready. Make sure I've got the trying to remember where I'm supposed to have that slideshow. No. Where is it? Oh, not this technology bullshit again. Oh, it is just set up slideshow. Okay. Alright, sorry. Ba-da-ba-ba. Okay. Again, I tried to full screen it from that. Okay, what interwar era? Quickly. So after World War One, there was a period of time between the wars. Obviously, interwar era, search for stability. World War One, like, really changed how people viewed the world. It was sobering, to say the least. And obviously, it's going to help us see how things led to World War II. So, let's jump right into it. The common theme for the end of the Great War, for everybody, for winners and losers, was to look for some kind of stability after Europe had been essentially decimated. Was again this search for stability. Everyone was in economic shambles. The victors were in massive debt to the United States. The losers, especially Germany, owed these war indemnities to the victors and had no real way of repaying. Like the way it was, the war indemnities were supposed to be paid to, the winners, France and Britain, and then they were going to use those to pay the debts to the United States. But whereas Germany is supposed to get that money when, it's been just as decimated as everyone else. Also, when the entire, I was going to say the country, when the entire continent has been put on a war footing for 4 years, most of the countryside has been decimated in all this warfare. The agricultural output has been stunted. The soldiers returning from warfare are strained. Um, so there was a push in many countries to reject this liberal democracy. There was this idea that this democracy, this idea of um, the liberal democracy had failed them. So this is where we got the totalitarian leadership. The idea was that while they would have to give up freedoms, the strong authoritarian rulers would be able to get faster change and make things better, hopefully for them, within the country. So here we are back in Russia. So as we said, once the war against the Germans was over, we had the Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, moved against the white Russian forces, who were the liberals and Tsarist loyalists. Now, not much is known about the white liberalist forces because once they were defeated, their records were either confiscated or just straight up destroyed. Now, the Red Army was very much at the advantage, bolstered by indoctrination and promises of this workers' paradise. The U.S., Great Britain, and France actually sent 15,000 men through Archangel. I should have a map image of where that is, to keep the communists from spreading, although they left a year later. The Japanese sent forces into Vladivostok and stayed until 1922, but then eventually just left the white forces to their fate, which was not a good fate when you're left with nowhere to retreat and the communist Russians are after you, or when the Russians in general are after you. I mean, you're not in a good place. It was especially bad in the border regions, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Siberia. Here we go. 10 million people died in these wars and the starvation that followed. There's the number I was looking for. Yeah, so in World War One, let me find that graph again. Yeah, World War One, we had about 1.75 million military deaths and 2 million civilian deaths. Auto? From World War One, and about 10 million deaths from the civil wars and the starvation involved therein, because the Russians don't do anything halfway. So, the Bolsheviks had control of this big central mass here. There's Archangel, where the Allied forces landed and attempted to aid. The Bolsheviks had, or the anti-Bolsheviks had some amount of control over these borderlands, but were eventually pushed out as the central location gained more and more power and were able to just push them back. So, and also this is something that happened during this period, was the proper creation of Soviet Union. Now, obviously, Marx and Engels had a lot to say about overthrowing a capitalist system, but not a lot to say about what to do once it was all over with. So Lenin really was flying by the seat of his pants as far as creating a communist state. Um, it was a partial success, but it wasn't really this hardline communist regime. Not really. He had the state seize control of private businesses to pay for the nation's debt, and got rid of the Romanov line in July of 1918. You know, put them against the wall and put lead in them. Sorry, buddy. Uh, he also created the secret police, the Cheka, and the re-education camps, or gulags, in Siberia. So if you were an enemy of the state, you would disappear. So the Communist Party was headed by a five-man Politburo, um, but it was obvious to everyone that Lenin was the one who was making the decisions. So there's that same picture of Lenin there up on the podium. No, that's not the same picture. You can't see the steps. It's the same podium though. Ah, yes. This is what happens if you disagree. Also, there's a gulag, you know, move around rocks, break down rocks. One of their favorite things to do was they would break the group up into two teams and spread them, you know, several miles apart so they couldn't see one another. Sorry, three teams. But no, I think it was just the two. Yeah, two teams. And spread them several miles apart so they couldn't see one another. And have one group building a railroad. You know, the just laying down tracks, laying down the railroad ties and the lines and everything. And the second team, several miles back, would pull up the railroad as they were going. You know, pull everything up, and then they would just transport not the team, so they wouldn't know what's going on. They just have, you know, the guards or whatever transport the material back up to the front group, and they'd build the railroad and move on as they're building the railroad, and then the second group would come along and pull the railroad back up. Excuse me, pull the railroad back up, just to, you know, put them to work, just to work them to death. So, during the Civil Wars, the Bolsheviks tried a policy of war communism. The peasants would be pushed into collective farms, dissolve all private property. Uh, this met with massive resistance and starvation, so Lenin had to pull back on this a bit. So the result was the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This was, again, a big thing back when I was doing the modern Russia history course. This allowed peasants to keep their land that had been seized during the wars, expanded a private sector, artists and writers expressed themselves in a Soviet cultural renaissance. So, while this wasn't exactly communist, it helped the country flourish economically. Now, it was supposed to be temporary, but Lenin died before he could end it himself. He died on January 21st, 1924, after several strokes. Um, St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was called due to World War One, was renamed Leningrad in his honor. Oh, I don't have any pictures. Well, I guess there's nothing to really have for an economic policy. So, with Lenin's death, there was a struggle for who would be his successor. So he had Yosef Vishnev Dugatsky, who was from Tbilisi, Georgia, managed to outmaneuver or purge his rivals and came out on top by 1927. This man took another name, Joseph Stalin, which means man of steel, and had a lot of talents for being a revolutionary. He could organize bank robberies, debate the finer points of Marxism, and knew how to get away from Tsarist police forces. I think he had been in the Tsarist gulag for a while, and managed to survive that. He's also ruthless and totally dedicated to the communist cause. He was also considered the least favorite of Lenin's political successors. Lenin saw him as the ruthless sort of man that would throw away lives, and that was very correct. Who dares? But of course, cult of personality. I don't know what that says. However, 1928, Stalin put an end to the NEP, and began his first 5-year plan to make the Soviet Union industrialized. But before you could have an industrial revolution, you had to have an agricultural revolution. The thing about that, that was how far behind the Russia was. That it hadn't even had the agricultural revolution we talked about, at the beginning of the semester. Of course, rather than wait for it to happen, because it happened naturally over the course of about a century in France and Britain, the Bolsheviks and Stalin forced it through collectivization. They forced peasants and nomadic peoples to settle in large collective farms, told them where to live, what to grow, and of course they had quotas to do away with hoarding and black market trading. So, this resulted in 13,000 riots in 1930 alone. So Stalin proclaimed that the party was, quote, dizzy with success, and then quietly suspended collectivization for a short time, because he's like, all right, we need to pull back on this so that everything doesn't fall apart. But we're going to tell everyone that we're doing so well that we don't need to do collectivization as much. So there he is, creepily looking over the trains and industry and stuff. Now, anyone who didn't meet these quotas were labeled kulaks, or tight fists. Were forcibly resettled onto farms, sent to factories, or sent off to gulags, because, of course. 1931, Stalin took revenge on the Ukrainian nationalists who attempted to resist the takeover by Russia. By setting the quota so high that the peasants would not be able to fill them even if they sacrificed seed grain. So, real quick, if you're not familiar with how farming works, uh, when you have your harvest, you don't just take all of it to market, or you shouldn't take all of it to market. You keep a portion of it as the seed for the next year, the next season. Um, so even if the peasants used all of their product, all of their crop, they still wouldn't be able to maintain the quotas that Stalin had set. So he accused them of hoarding grain, sent the Red Army to confiscate any grain that was kept in the homes and barns, which is to say was the percentage of the grain that was being kept for food. So by 1933, people were dying at the rate of 10,000 per day. Cannibalism was commonplace. All the while, Stalin was exporting grain to other countries. 9 million people starved to death because of Stalin's policy. So, here are some awful images. I apologize in advance. But this is what Stalin did to Ukraine. And a lot of people in Ukraine are still very anti-Russian because of this. Actually, it depends on where you are in Russia, apparently. I had a student who was Ukrainian, and her in-laws were, she was from she was from Western Ukraine, and her mother-in-law was from Northern Ukraine, and her opinion of Russia was whatever, but her mother-in-law's opinion on Russia was that, like, they were literally the devil. Like, it was literally where Satan lived. So, it's pretty interesting. So, Russia had a great terror too, not to be outdone by France. Stalin's paranoia led him to purge the Communist Party repeatedly, including the army, the bureaucracy, and even his own inner circle. So there was nowhere in Russia to be safe when Stalin was in charge. Excuse me. Leon Trotsky, who was, head of the Red Army, was expelled from the party along with 1,500 sympathizers in 1927. By 29, he was exiled entirely, and by 1940, he suffered from a case of ice pick to the brain in Mexico, courtesy of Stalin's agents. So yeah, I mean, that's some paranoia if you're killing Trotsky. So by 1938, 700,000 party members, mainly folks in the army, had been killed due to Stalin's concern or just anger about their autonomy or lack of loyalty. So the thing about being in Stalin's Russia, you couldn't be too good at what you were doing because you would be seen as a actually, this is why, the Russia Soviet Russia was seen as like being haphazard and falling apart, was because Stalin made people afraid to excel, because if you did, you'd be seen as a threat and Stalin would have you killed. Like, it was crazy. So yeah, the estimates put the number of lives destroyed by Stalin between 14 to 40 million people between 1927 and 1953. So Stalin was terrifying, and I mean he sticks around until after World War II. So he's in this the entire time. So I mean, we're gonna move on to there's some people Stalin had killed. Um, just piles of bodies. Still, though, there was some good stuff going on in Soviet Russia. Uh, the vast number of peasants in the former Russian Empire were a little better off in the collective farms or in the cities. They had access to some amount of education. The city dwellers experienced new technologies, electric lights, movies, railways, that sort of thing. Of course, it's all propaganda, but like I said, it's not that different than this era of the United States. Um, and also, as I said, with all the high officials who were just wiped out, uh, there was lots of upward mobility. It was pretty easy to get into high level civil service jobs as long as you're willing to toe the line and, be completely loyal to the party, uh, often at the expense of everyone around you. So, there's that, I guess. So, obviously, Soviet Union had a very good propaganda machine. Um, they were, of course, told how much better off they were than under the Tsarist Empire or even under the unequal capitalist regimes in the West. Again, not any different than how things were here. It's like, oh, it's so much better than in the Soviet Union. Um, and despite how rough things were after getting rid of the NEP, um, the Soviets were able to claim victory when the Great Depression happened and really didn't affect uh, the USSR because it really wasn't affected. It really wasn't tied to capitalist markets and therefore didn't really feel it. Obviously, if citizens that were born after the war and simply didn't know anything beyond the USSR were further indoctrinated. There was the Communist Youth League, or Komsomol. Uh, Children and teenagers were encouraged to watch adults, including their parents, for any sign of disloyalty. Yeah, there we go. Look at that. Is that? I hope that's not a mustache. What you want, Otto? Hmm. What? So while the Tsarist secret police were rough, um, it was nothing compared to the Cheka. Any kind of complaining or other disloyalty, including falling behind on quotas, was met with violence. Led to many people calling out their family or neighbors to be seen as a good comrade, to receive better treatment, or simply escape the violence themselves. Even if, your neighbors or family didn't do anything, you were just trying to show how good you were, so you'd be left alone. Even those who worked hard were worried by the party, like Alexei Starkhanov, known as Starkhanovites, were resented and sometimes attacked by other workers for speeding up production lines because basically Starkhanov was a hard worker in the coal mines and was able to get a lot done more quickly, and so the those running the coal mines, they were like, hey, that's very good, that's going to be the new normal, and the rest of the workers were like, you son of a bitch. Okay, on to France and Britain, because like I said, I need to get through as much of this as I can. So, despite being victorious, France and Britain had their own shared problems: the war debts, economic collapse, food shortages, the issues of the colonial holdings, wanted their own independence, etc. Don't bite me, you asshole. You're shedding. There was also socialist posturing within these states, as well as right wing movements. Stop biting me. But they did avoid outright fascism. In Britain especially, there was very little support for fascism, although Winston Churchill was quite conservative and was very visible in the public eye. I mean, obviously, he was Prime Minister during the Second World War. I know it. France had a large left-wing union, Popular Front, who worked to keep the fascist parties out of power. So there's old Winston Churchill. Much older than last time we saw him. Sit up. Be good. Smile for the camera. Don't bite me. Why do you have to bite me? So, immediately after the war and during the times of the Great Depression, demonstrations and riots pushed the government to do more about the failings of the free market. Because, the free market wasn't exactly able to handle the sudden shock of the wars and the depressions and what happened. And big sudden oh shit. Big sudden viruses. As we've come to see. What the hell? Come back. There we go. Anyway. Now, of course, they were wary of government seizure of private assets. They're willing to listen to some demands in order to avoid revolution, because you don't want that. So 1919, 8-hour days were made standard in Britain and France. The Labour Party in Britain was placated with government-built flats to replace the slums that workers had to deal with. Now, these created the modern welfare state, created safety nets to prevent starvation and keep citizens from becoming extremists. So, keep things from being too awful. What do you think, Otto? Now, after this war, the mandates, which, as I'd said before, were those regions that were seen as being not able to govern themselves yet, but would be allowed to at a later date. I don't know. It was weird middle ground. Um, Mandates and colonies both wanted home rule, especially the colonies that fought and died for their European overlords. Then, of course, the Irish nationalists declared their freedom in 1919, created the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Um, the British would have none of it, but by the end of 1921, the British finally called a truce. And again, this could be it could be an entire class. In fact, I'm pretty sure Dr. Kennedy isn't teaching that much anymore. It's kind of depressing. Dr. Kennedy had like an entire course on, Ireland and all of that. So, by 1921, Britain did call a truce. By January of 1922, the Anglo-Irish Treaty created the Irish Free State. But any counties that wanted to opt out could. So the northern 6 counties that were Protestant did opt out and became Northern Ireland. So by 1921, we did get, or 1922 rather, we did get the Republic of Ireland as we have it today. Not that it stopped the Irish from being rowdy. Many of them were still like, oh, we want Northern Ireland too. Uh, 1922, Egypt was free from British rule. In 1932, Iraq became independent as well. Sorry, my cat's distracting me. Still, though, not all of this was honored. Mahatma Gandhi in India and Siasan in Burma found that it took a lot to get, their overlords to pay attention. And then, of course, the French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies were revolting and attempting to force their overlords to grant them independence. This is Dublin. Towards the start of the war, Britain decided to shell the city from the sea. The Irish will not let anyone forget that. I walked around Dublin a lot. There's the IRA. There they are marching out with their flag. And of course, it's got a dog in it, therefore it's important. Let's get a little bit further. Now, a lot of these interwar democracies were looking for military men who were serving the Great War to try and create some amount of stability. Some countries willingly gave up their democracies, and others were toppled by force. Some countries were toppled to get rid of corruption and civil strife, like Poland and Spain. Others found a new authoritarian model, which is to say fascism. Now, fascism was named after the Latin term fasces, which is the bundle of sticks tied around an axe, which is a symbol of authority and power in ancient Rome. This put authoritarian leaders into power with the support of the masses, and technically it's a legal overthrow of power because it's voted in. And we'll get to fascism and communism next time, because that's a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, I mean, I'd like to keep going, but we're out of time. Yeah, so I'll put this PowerPoint up after my next class. The test, which I'll put up, I guess, at the beginning of next week, excuse me, will stop at World War One, and it'll be set up like probably, hopefully, like Monday or Tuesday, and you guys will have like a week to do it. I mean, I'll give you more time than I did last time. This chapter won't be on it. I just wanted to go ahead and start on the stuff for the final, like, immediately. But yeah, the stuff leading up to World War One and then the World War One chapter, that'll be the stuff for the next test, and it'll be just like the last one. It'll be, I mean, I've got to convert it into the essay form, and then put that up on Blackboard. So I'm going to convert it over the weekend while at work, and then I'll upload it either Sunday afternoon or Monday. So then I'll email you guys and let you know that it's up, and you guys can work on it at your leisure, because we don't have a ton of time in this semester left. So we'll get to that. And yeah. So with that said, any word on the papers? Yeah, I need to do those as well. I haven't actually. I need to grade those over this weekend too. So the next paper, the second paper, I'll just have that due. Just the last, like, when the finals do, like, whenever that is. I think the last day of class is the 27th, 28th. When is their final calendar? Alright, exams are exams are April 29th and May 5th. I don't know exactly when our exam would be, but spring classes end on the 27th, so we literally have next week to get this done. Now, reading day is the 28th, or Tuesday the 28th, so I can take questions and whatnot on that day. They help you guys out as needed. This whole thing has been a disaster. At least as far as my scheduling is concerned. I mean, my scheduling was kind of everywhere to begin with. Yeah. So again, the second paper is just like who you think started World War One, or if you just want to do anything, anytime in that time period between Napoleon and like World War Two. So feel free to. All right. That'll have to do. I need to get ready for my next class. Feed the dog. Have a little food for myself. Uh, yeah. So I'll see you guys next week. I'll hopefully have some stuff for you guys by then. Um, yeah. Y'all take care and see y'all later on. Have a good weekend. Bye for now.